Hello friends, so today's video is going to be another worst trends of fantasy. Specifically, these are going to be the worst trends according to you. So I did a part 1 to this where I was talking about some of the things that I can't stand that are currently occurring within fantasy, and then I asked over on my Instagram stories, what are your worst trends? And there were a lot of different answers, so this alone could be broken up into multiple parts. If you'd like to see a part 2 to this, just let me know, but I'm going to jump right into it. The first one, no surprise. I absolutely expected this to be here, but anything to do with fae, how it gets used way too much, how you feel it's ruining the fantasy genre, it's actually ruining the romance genre as well, it's decreasing the quality of books, it's making everything about tropes, so things to do with fae. And some of you specifically pointed to Sarah J. Maas, and I will say, I think that I don't have an issue with fae in theory. What I don't like is fae stories that follow the exact same story beats, or they represent fae in the, what I'm going to say is the Sarah J. Maas way. So Sarah J. Maas has kind of made fae these sexy animal-like beings who want to be dominant, and there's alpha males and things like that. And yeah, I'm pretty over that. I don't need any more of that. I think it's okay here and there. But you started to see book after book after book just basically be another A Court of Thorns and Roses, and it got old. It's been old. How is it still going on? That said, I am not currently tired of fae stories that have to do with fae being tricksters, or fae being more tied to the environment, fae being genuinely terrifying, them playing a role in everyday life in almost like a historical fiction sense, where they are ruining people's lives. Is that bad of me? Where I'm like, I don't want to see them fall in love. I want to see them destroy people. I just mean these other aspects of what fae stories can be and what fae can be. I'm okay with that. So I'm not completely just disregarding any book where the synopsis mentions fae, because I still think there are things to do. I just think that we have currently exhausted the sexy fae plotline, and I'll add, I don't even mind if they're attractive and if they're a love interest, but it's the repetitiveness. It's the fact that we're having the exact same types of love interests, we're having the exact same looking, they literally look identical to the ones in A Court of Thorns and Roses. So yes, I would agree. I'm pretty tired of this, and I would like us to move on. Can we move on back to animal companions? We need more of them. Can we have animal companions back? I want to see something cute and precious, or something ferocious and amazing. Let's do that. We don't need any more sexy fae. Next up is one that I don't know that I agree, but I can see this. I agree that it's a trend. I just don't know if I think it's one of the worst trends. And that would be how popular duologies have become. So the reason that I'm not opposed to duologies and that I quite like them is because I do think that for a while trilogies were kind of the norm in fantasy, and sometimes they did not need to be. Sometimes the middle book was extremely weak, and it felt like it was collapsing under the weight of book 1 and book 3, because ultimately part of it should have just been part of book 1 and part of it should have just been part of book 3. So it really honestly should have been a duology. So I do like that it feels as though we're recognizing sometimes the story can be told in just 2 books. We don't need to prolong anything. We don't need these irrelevant plot lines. We don't need to drag out certain interactions between characters and subplots. We can just tell the story we need to tell in 2 books. That said, I do think some duologies, I'll read them and I think, did this really need a sequel? I think we could have just made it a standalone. So I don't like that. And if that's where you're coming from, and I would guess that's probably where you're coming from. If that's where you're coming from, I would agree that I don't like that direction. So in what was great about duologies is taking the elongated story that didn't need to be elongated and realizing it can be locked in very well in 2 books. But some duologies are pulling from the exact negative thing I don't like, which is where they're taking what should be a standalone and they're elongating it into a duology, so it turns into the exact same problem. I will add one additional factor. Something like Strange the Dreamer, which I love so much, that book just ends. It just ends, and you're like, where's the second one? It really does feel like out of nowhere, the concept of cliffhanger, of just walking off a cliff, that's what it felt like. And I can understand people being frustrated at what feels like a book that we could have just had the whole thing. But the downside is there are some books that would be incredibly long, and I think it would ultimately hurt the success of the book if you didn't break it up into 2 parts, because the length would deter people and would make people not want to pick it up. So it makes it more digestible and accessible when you have it broken up. But you do run the risk of having that it feels like we just slice the story in half feeling. So there's pros and cons. I still lean toward, I think it's ultimately a pro, but I do recognize that there are absolutely cons with this as well. Next up, we have one that this gets brought up a lot, so this isn't surprising, but a blank of blank and blank. And I've said before that I feel like A Court of Thorns and Roses was kind of the origin for this, and a lot of people kind of, I feel like, were like, excuse me, it's actually A Song of Ice and Fire started this trend. And I'm like, okay, I feel like A Song of Ice and Fire did the concept of this title format before A Court of Thorns and Roses, of course. But I feel like things really took off with the A Court of Thorns and Roses, because it was A Court of Thorns and Roses, and then what is the second one called? Akamath, A Court of Mist and Fury. You can tell I'm not a fan. A Court of Mist and Fury, A Court of Silver Flames. I forgot what the third one's called, A Court of Wings and Ruin, I think. So it followed its own trend for 4 books, more than that, because there's a novella. So then it felt like everything then started doing that, because that was hugely successful. And also people say Game of Thrones all the time anyway. I'm not trying to argue. I shouldn't. Anyway, you're right if you've pointed out that it originally likely came from A Song of Ice and Fire. I think the popularity came from A Court of Thorns and Roses. The point, though, sorry for my rambling, is that it's old. I'm with you. I'm tired of it. I do think that really long titles are becoming more common, and I don't know how I feel about that. I loved the book A Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, but that is a really long title. I really quite enjoyed Song of Silver Flame Like Night. I like the pattern of that, and I think there is a reason for it being grouped like that. But my point just being that we're starting to get really long titles that don't follow that format, but they're really long, and I'm like, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. The next one is Dark Academia. So I will admit, I didn't think Dark Academia was even that big of a deal until Babel came out, and then everybody seemed to be making Dark Academia themed vlogs. They were making Dark Academia themed reading lists. They were doing cool things with their outfits, and I kind of liked that, but I still don't really think it's a trend to the same degree that something like Fae stories are. I know maybe it's just that I don't gravitate toward them, and so I have a blind spot, and it's my own bubble where I'm more into fantasy with dragons and political fantasy and things like that, and so I'm not aware. So perhaps it is more of a trend than I'm realizing. But I also think Dark Academia is not specific to fantasy. So maybe that's another reason is I am so fantasy driven in my reading. And so some of the other Dark Academia books I think are just sold in fiction because they don't necessarily always have those other components to them. The next one is too much romance or smut in young adult books. So they're slightly 2 different topics, but I'm kind of combining them. So too much romance, I think it's just that we're starting to see romance and fantasy blend more, and it is becoming its own genre. The problem is it's not really always sold as its own genre, and some books probably lean more romance, but they're getting shelved as fantasy. And so if you're a fantasy reader, you're like, this is a romance book. But you picked it up with the expectation that it was going to be more so fantasy. So I don't agree that it's a worse trend, that it's one of the worst trends in fantasy right now, because I think it's just a emerging genre, and that's fine. I think that the trend of us not acknowledging that there is this genre, I think that's the trend that I don't like, that because it does result in expectations that are not met. And this includes romance readers. Sometimes romance readers want to read a romance, and then they're getting all this other stuff, and they're like, I don't care about all this other stuff. Maybe little sprinkles, but this is so much world building, or this is so much magic, and I don't really care about this magic. I just want to watch these characters fall in love. And I would understand why that would be frustrating for them as well. So I'm all for there being more fantasy romance. I think that that's great. And I think it's strangely almost sometimes easier for people to get into fantasy romance than it is for them to get into fantasy or romance. So I'm all for a genre that makes this more accessible, and that maybe eventually you'll get the people that read fantasy romance and they're like, I really like the fantasy, and they might want to read more epic fantasy, which makes me happy because I love fantasy. And then you'll probably get some people that want to pick up the romance books, and romance books can be very happy and cute and fun. So I can see it being a great opportunity for people to get into reading and then kind of lead them into other places. So overall, I would say there's more pros than cons. And I'm just kind of repeating myself here. I truly do think that the con is just it not having its own place. That said, the other part of this, the smut in YA, aside from maybe A Court of Thorns and Roses, I don't know if I've come across smut in YA, and it could just be us having a disagreement on the word smut, because I don't want to sound condescending in any fashion, so I apologize if this comes out the wrong way, but there's a part of me that's like, have you read smut? Because I've not read a YA book that has smut to the degree that smutty books do. So an example, like the book A Game of Fate, I would say is a smutty book, and it was not for me whatsoever, but that I would categorize as smutty. And that even had more of a plot than I feel like certain smutty books do. So I've not encountered that anywhere. And I even said besides A Court of Thorns and Roses, but even A Court of Thorns and Roses, that first book, is not even close to the level of specific depictions of encounters between adults. You know, I haven't really seen that. So this could just be that I don't know, and that there's actually a plethora of books out there that have just absolutely egregious lines being crossed and left and right. I don't know. I haven't seen it. If you have examples, then feel free to let me know, because I am curious if that's becoming a trend. It's just not a trend that I've really seen. That's it for some of your worst trends in fantasy. Like I said, there are a lot more, so I would happily do another part to this, maybe even 2 more parts to this, because there's a lot of things that you don't like that are going on in fantasy right now. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. Feel free to let me know some of your other least favorite trends in the comments down below. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.